Oscar Pistorius will learn his fate tomorrow at his parole hearing. The disgraced Paralympian was convicted for shooting and killing his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp on Valentine's Day in 2013. He served nearly 9 years behind bars. Tomorrow he's expected to make his bid for freedom. eNCA's Heidi Giokos has been following the story and she joins us now in studio. Heidi, thank you so much. I don't think any of us will ever forget that day when the news came through on Valentine's Day in 2013. That Oscar Pistorius had shot his girlfriend, and it was just in the news for months and months and months. Televised court case, just astonishing, the whole experience. Talk to us about, just refresh us, the case, what happened. Take us through that first of all.
Yes, so I think it's important to go back to what happened on the 14th of February 2013, where we do know that Oscar Pistorius fired 4 shots in the bathroom of his house in the east of Pretoria. We do know that he, of course, fired those 4 shots, and in 2014 he was sentenced to 13 years and 5 months. But it's important to highlight, before we move away from that aspect, that he was initially convicted and sentenced to and charged with culpable homicide. It was then later appealed at the Supreme Court, and
yes, it was Advocate Heidi Giokos acting for the state at that time, wasn't
yes,
it?
That conviction was changed to murder, and there was a lot of confusion and discrepancies about the time that he already served, but overall he had been sentenced to 13.5 years. Fast track to 2023, he has been serving he has served 8 years, round about 8 years, which means he's basically eligible for parole. But just to go back to that day, it was the 14th of Feb 2013, and we do know that there was so much confusion as to what exactly happened, because it was just Oscar Pistorius and Reeva Steenkamp inside that house. He says he wasn't sure, he thought there was an intruder in the house, and we do know that the door was actually closed, and this is why there were 4 shots that were fired in that bathroom, and tragically Reeva Steenkamp lost her life.
Yeah, and now he's in prison. At that time, he was South Africa's golden boy. I mean, he was at the pinnacle of his fame as the Blade Runner, as we knew him then, now in prison. And tomorrow, talk us through what happens, because my understanding of parole is it's automatically triggered, the request for parole. The process is automatically triggered after you've served half your sentence. But there's a lot that happens in the build-up to what we're going to see tomorrow, and there could actually be quite a long wait before he hears.
Yes, I think there's a lot of frustration also from South Africans, understandably so. Everybody's questioning why Oscar Pistorius is eligible for parole, but we need to remember and understand that he did not get a life sentence. Therefore, he is eligible for parole. And the whole purpose of the parole system and how it actually works is to ensure that when somebody has served possibly half of their sentence, which in this case is possibly even more than half that Oscar has served, they are immediately eligible for parole. It automatically gets the parole board to look into the matter, and it's normally done 6 months before they actually are eligible for parole to make all considerations. In this particular case, we do know that the parole board will sit tomorrow, and they will, of course, consider all representations. Now, there are 2 ways in which the parole actually works in South Africa. You are granted full parole, which means that you are released from prison, of course with certain restrictions and some sorts of supervision, or you're under correctional supervision, which means that you're basically still confined to a certain area or certain radius, and you cannot...
so is that like house arrest?
Yes, almost like house arrest. That's exactly it. So that's how the 2 systems work. In this case, it's going to be interesting to see how it works, because he served half of his parole, half of his sentence rather, and it also depends on your behavior in prison. So, you know, has he been rehabilitated? Has he been part of those specific programs? And that will all be considered by the board.
So I'm just looking through the screen that we've got up. It's so useful. you're saying, you know, that 6 months before minimum sentence is completed, the case management committee actually puts together a case. That is then handed to the parole board. Where are we? What's going to happen tomorrow? Is Oscar actually appearing before the parole board? Have they made their recommendations yet? Do you know where we're at?
So I think the process will start tomorrow. I think what's important as well is the fact that this is not the first time there has been a consideration for Oscar Pistorius' parole. Late last year, there was also some kind of consideration, but because of the confusion around the fact that there was confusion around how long he had been serving because the conviction was changed from culpable homicide to murder.
Yes.
That was not considered, but now he is eligible. So tomorrow I think they will start with fresh representations, which will include that of Oscar Pistorius as well as the victim's family, in this case the Steenkamp family.
All right, let's listen to what Correctional Services has said today about this.
Parole hearing for inmate Oscar Leonard Pistorius is due to take place on the 31st of March 2023 at Correctional Facility in Tshwane. This is a platform where the victims of crime are afforded an opportunity to make representation either orally or in written form before the parole board. The same courtesy has to be afforded to the inmate. At the end of that session, the board will deliberate and pronounce its decision, which might not be on the same day of the sitting. It has to be understood that Mr. Pistorius was given a 13 years and 5 month sentence and has served just over 7 years, meaning that he has served the minimum required time, thus becoming eligible to be considered for parole placement.
Okay, so there's a lot of discussion, and it is part of our law that you have a right to be eligible for parole. That very much deals with an offender's, you know, their track record in prison, if they've shown that they have really sort of learned from their mistakes, etc., etc. But what about the rights of the victims or the victim's family? What rights do they have in this process?
Yes, they have a huge right, and they are entitled to be informed about possible parole and the parole process. What we do know and what we do understand is that the victims or the victim's family are allowed to make representations as to why they believe or do not believe that for example, in this case, Oscar Pistorius should be granted parole or should not be granted parole. In this case, what we do understand is that it's going to be June Steenkamp who will be making representations tomorrow before the parole board. And what we know is that she will be opposing parole for Oscar Pistorius. And the reason for this, Sally, is because the Steenkamp family believe that they still do not understand why Reeva Steenkamp was shot and killed. They feel as though Oscar Pistorius has not been truthful from the very beginning. He has not been remorseful, and the family feel they deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to know why their daughter was killed in that manner.
Yeah.
We got a chance to actually speak to the legal representative of the Steenkamp family, just explaining what they are going to be presenting tomorrow to the parole board.
June and Barry accepts that parole is part of our South African legal system, and Oscar Pistorius, just like any other offender, is entitled to be considered for placement on parole after having served a certain portion of his sentence. They have always questioned Oscar Pistorius' version of what happened that night, in the same way that the Supreme Court of Appeal have said that Pistorius had failed to explain why he fired the fatal shots and failed to take the court fully into his confidence, as he did not explain to the court what exactly had happened that night.
Yeah, of course, the prosecution saying that neighbours heard fighting and that he lost his cool and shot at her through the door. The defence, Oscar Pistorius, always saying, I thought it was an intruder and that's why I shot through the door. Of course, the family cannot keep someone in prison indefinitely. We saw it with Dimpo Hani. Janus Valers eventually was released on parole, even though she vehemently disagreed with this. So they have a say, but they don't have the final say. When are we likely to hear a decision?
Yes, we're not entirely sure. Correctional Services have indicated that they cannot give a time frame. It could be hours, it could be days, it could be weeks, it could even be months. We're not entirely sure of a time frame. I'm sure they'll have to take in all representations and consider all factors. It is, of course, a very sensitive matter, but at the end of the day, as you mentioned, if someone is eligible, they have to, of course, consider that as well.
And unlike the trial, this will not be televised.
No, unfortunately, it will not be televised, but we will be camping outside.
I'm sure
and
you
try
will,
and bring you
Heidi.
every angle.
Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. That is going to be a big story from tomorrow. Heidi Giokos there.